6 months. Exactly 6 months had passed since the day that L. Changmin mentally referred to as the incident. It wasn't just a bad day, it was a glitch in the well-oiled system of his life. A system he'd spent years building to protect himself from any unexpected events. The incident was trivial. Lunch at a restaurant. He couldn't remember which one. He had 3 business meetings that day, and he'd stopped for a bite at the first place he saw that looked respectable. It was his mistake. Trusting appearances. A few hours later, his world had shrunk to the walls of his bedroom. His body was paralyzed by weakness, and his stomach was twisted by excruciating pain. An entire day had vanished from his life. An entire day that should have included important negotiations. Negotiations that promised a large return. Money had been lost, but worse than money was the lost time and broken trust. He didn't show up for the meetings. For a man of his position, this was unacceptable. Usually, if a problem arose in his life, Jung Min would solve it radically and permanently. Removing the source of the threat was his rule. But how to eliminate every restaurant in the city? It was impossible and foolish. His anger demanded an outlet, but his mind suggested a different, more sophisticated solution. If he couldn't control the quality of the food from the outside, he had to move its source inside. Under his complete control. And so he had an idea. Find a personal chef. Not a Michelin-starred chef with an inflated ego, but someone he could cultivate himself. A clean slate, as he called it. Someone without bad habits, without established methods, without connections in the restaurant world. Someone who would be grateful for the opportunity and loyal to the chance. His men found Ayla, a young woman who had been working odd jobs, dreaming of cooking but lacking the means to study. She had no experience, only a sparkling eye and a desire to learn. It was perfect. The next step was the kitchen. Jung Min didn't remodel the existing one. He carved out a spacious room on the ground floor of his house and transformed it into a culinary temple. He personally approved every design. It featured the best imaginable: induction cooktops with precise temperature control, powerful range hoods, built-in ovens with convection, and refrigeration units with a modern system to prevent food from drying out. He purchased Japanese knives made of the finest steel, heavy cast-iron frying pans, and copper pots. The floors and walls were finished with easy-to-clean, crevice-free material to ensure not a speck of dust or dirt could remain. This wasn't a kitchen, but a surgical suite, where the most important patient was the food. Ayla's training became his personal project. He didn't just hire the city's best chefs for her. He created a program based on his principles: safety and quality. These were the 2 main dogmas. He himself attended many of the lessons, sitting in the corner and observing. He watched as her fingers, unsure on the first day, learned to hold a knife at the correct angle, how she washed greens 100 times, memorizing that any grain of sand, even the smallest, was a failure, how she studied the temperatures that kill all harmful bacteria in meat and poultry while preserving juiciness. He taught her more than just cooking. He taught her how to choose. Once a week, they went together to the high-end market, where produce was selected for the city's best restaurants. Jungmin taught her to look, smell, and touch. He showed her what perfectly fresh tuna should look like, which beef had the right marbling, which vegetables had the right crunch. He explained that every product that entered his kitchen had to have an impeccable history. After several months of intensive training, her first day arrived. No exams, no test dishes. Jungmin simply walked into the kitchen and said, "You're cooking dinner for me today." He trusted his eyes and his instincts. He watched her lay out the ingredients, check the refrigerator temperature, and wipe down the countertop with an antibacterial wipe, even though it was clean. She was ready. He still remembered that first dinner. It was a simple dish, rice with beef and vegetables. But it wasn't just rice. Every grain stood alone. The sauce was perfectly balanced. Not too salty, not too sweet, and the meat melted in his mouth. It wasn't haute cuisine. It was the perfect meal. One that not only satisfied his hunger, but also gave him a feeling of absolute comfort and safety. 6 months had passed since then. During that time, he hadn't had a single complaint about Ayla. The food was always impeccable, but more importantly, it was consistent. He always knew what to expect, and over time, he noticed that Ayla had developed her own style. She began to bring something unique to the dishes. Small, subtle hints of spices that she apparently remembered from childhood, unusual combinations of textures. At first, he was wary, but then he came to appreciate it. Now he couldn't imagine mornings without her special, airy pancakes with the subtle tartness of wild berries. He couldn't eat soup anywhere else because only she had it at the exact temperature and consistency he liked. He became dependent on her food, and it was a good dependence, like dependence on a reliable partner or a well-oiled machine. It was no longer just a matter of safety. It was a matter of taste, his taste. This dependence became especially evident when he had to travel on business. The first such trip after starting her job made him nervous. He stood in his cloakroom, thinking not about the upcoming negotiations, but about what he was going to eat. The idea of relying on a restaurant chef again, even in the most expensive hotel, provoked an internal resistance. He couldn't take the risk, never again. Then he came up with a solution. He went into Ayla's kitchen. "I need to leave for 2 days," he said. "Prepare some food for me in containers." She raised her eyebrows in surprise, but nodded. "Okay, sir, what do you want?" "Something that won't spoil. Something that can be easily reheated. Something that I usually eat." He could see how hard she worked. She'd prepared several containers for him with carefully planned dishes. Marinated chicken with rice, noodles with vegetables, sliced fruit. Even her signature pancakes. Each container was labeled Lunch, Day 1, Dinner, Day 1. She'd packed everything in a special thermal bag with refrigerants. At the hotel, while his partners dined in the hotel restaurant, he would go up to his room and heat up food from containers in the microwave. It seemed strange, perhaps even comical, but when he took the first bite, all doubts disappeared. This was his taste, his food, from his kitchen, made with his ingredients. It gave him a sense of control, calm, and a home away from home, and so it became a habit. Before every trip, he'd say to her, "Ayla, these containers, enough for 3 days." And she'd nod and head to the kitchen. He'd even bought special, expensive, durable glass containers for this purpose, which held the temperature well and didn't absorb odors. He paid her generously. Her salary was several times higher than any cook in the city. He provided her with health insurance she could only dream of. For him, these weren't expenses, but investments. Investments in his safety, his health, and his comfort. Ayla wasn't just an employee. She became an essential, almost indispensable cog in his world. A world he built to be invulnerable. And while she made her perfect pancakes, he felt completely in control. At precisely 7 in the morning, El Changmin sat at the dining room table. The sunlight, soft and not yet hot, fell through the huge picture window, illuminating the perfectly polished dark wood tabletop. The air was filled with the familiar, appetite-inducing aroma of his morning pancakes cooking. That same smell that had become synonymous with the start of a new day, predictability and control. He heard the familiar sounds outside the kitchen door. The measured tap of a knife on a cutting board, the quiet rustle of dough being stirred, the clink of ceramic dishes. Everything was as usual. And yet, for several days now, something had been off. Something elusive that disrupted the perfect harmony of his mornings. The door opened, and Ayla walked into the dining room. She usually entered with a plate in her hands, a wide, open smile on her face. She invariably said, "Good morning, Mr. Lee," and her voice, clear and cheerful, woke him up better than any coffee. She might comment on a dish. "I added a little lemon zest today. I think you'll like it." Or, "The berries were so fresh today, I couldn't resist." She would place the plate in front of him and pause for a few seconds, eagerly awaiting his first reaction, his nod or a short "good," which for her were the highest reward. Now everything was different. In recent days, she entered silently, like a shadow. Her gaze was lowered to the floor. She never spoke. She approached the table, placed a plate with such care as if it were a crystal vase and not sturdy porcelain, and then, without looking up, turned and walked back to the kitchen. The door closed behind her almost soundlessly. The entire ritual took no more than 10 seconds. It wasn't just her smile that was gone. Her energy, her presence. She served her purpose, but her soul was gone from the process. Changmin, a man accustomed to reading people better than open books, noticed this change immediately. He chalked the first day up to a bad mood. Everyone gets that way. The second day made him wary. By the third day, a familiar cold feeling of unease had awakened within him, A threat. Maybe not to him personally, but a threat to the stability of his small world. Ayla was part of that world. He didn't ask any questions. Interfering in his employees' personal lives wasn't part of his principles. He respected boundaries. If someone doesn't ask for help, they don't need it. Maybe she was having problems with her boyfriend or family difficulties. That was her business. He was paying her for food, not for her confidences. But that day, the fourth of her strange behavior, he broke his rule of non-interference. She was setting a bowl of soup in front of him for lunch. Her movements were abrupt, angular. She leaned over and the light from the chandelier fell on her face at such an angle that he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Under her left eye, just at her temple, lay a small but distinct shadow, uneven, with a yellowish-green tint at the edges and a darker crimson center. It was a bruise, but not the kind you get from accidentally bumping into the corner of a cabinet or from a fall. Changmin knew the difference. He'd spent half his life in a world where such marks were the language of communication. This bruise was perfectly round, almost perfectly round. A knuckle mark. Someone's fist had left that mark on her face. The blow was precise, deliberate. Someone had hit her, hard. Everything inside him went cold. This was no longer just anxiety. This was anger. Quiet, concentrated, like a knife blade. His cook, his person, the one in whose hands his well-being depended. She bore the mark of a tyrant. He continued eating, pretending not to notice. His face remained impassive, a mask. But his mind worked with its usual analytical speed. He began to observe. Now it was not just passive curiosity, but active investigation. The next day, he noticed another bruise, this time on her left wrist. It looked like a dark purple mark, a fingerprint. Someone had squeezed her hand hard. Held it. Ayla had been cooking that day in a long-sleeved chef's coat, but when she reached for spices from the top shelf, the cuff slipped, and he saw the mark. She immediately pulled her sleeve back, but it was too late. He had already seen it all. His silent observation became unbearable. He caught himself looking not at the food during dinner, but at her hands, at the way she turned her head, trying to discern new traces. His world, so reliable and predictable, had cracked again, and this time, the threat came not from without, but penetrated within, through someone he himself had allowed into his sanctuary, or rather, through someone who was in her life. He respected her privacy, but this was no longer a personal matter. It directly affected him. If she suffered, so would the quality of her work. Her depression, her fear, all of it was dangerous. Dangerous for him. She could make a mistake, overlook something, get distracted. No, he couldn't allow that. But something else troubled him most of all. A strange, almost alien feeling was awakening within him, a desire to protect. She was under his protection. She worked for him. And if someone harmed one of his employees, it was a personal challenge to him. The morning of the 6th day was a turning point. Ayla brought his favorite pancakes. They lay on a plate in a golden stack, maple syrup steaming in a small bowl nearby, and fresh berries on another saucer. Everything was perfect, but she was a shadow of her former self. She walked in, her face pale, her eyes puffy from sleepless nights. She tried to approach the table so that her right profile was facing him. She thought he wouldn't notice, but he noticed. He saw everything, the way she moved around the dining room, as if afraid of breaking, the way her shoulders were tense, the way her gaze, usually direct and open, now darted restlessly around the room, avoiding his. She put down her plate and turned abruptly to leave, and at that moment, something snapped inside him. His patience snapped. He'd watched, respected her boundaries, waited. But now he saw the obvious mark, a huge, fresh bruise covering part of her cheek and temple. It was no longer hidden. It was a public declaration of her pain. This couldn't go on. "Ayla," he said, his voice ringing out louder in the quiet dining room than he'd intended. She froze at the door, startled, as if caught in the act. Her back tensed. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned to face him. Her eyes were full of fear, not the respectful fear she sometimes felt in front of him, but a primal, panicky terror. "Turn around," he said quietly, but in a way that made the room even quieter. He didn't raise his voice. There was no anger in his tone. There was only an unwavering command. She didn't move, frozen in a stupor. It seemed she wasn't breathing. "The other side, show me!" he repeated, and there was steel in his words. Slowly, as if against her will, she took a step forward, then another. She stopped a couple of meters from the table. Her fingers convulsively clenched and unclenched the edge of her apron. Another agonizing second passed. Then, closing her eyes, she turned her head. Light from the window fell on the left side of her face. What he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't just a bruise, it was a wound. A large, spreading purple-blue mark covered almost her entire cheekbone, extending to her temple. In the center was a bruise, caked with blood. A blow of that force could have cracked bone. It was fresh, very fresh, perhaps this morning, or last night. He watched, his own expression stony. But inside, a storm raged. All his experience, all his knowledge of human cruelty, screamed at him that this was no isolated incident. This was a pattern. This was a ritual. He looked up from her cheek to her eyes. She looked at him, and in her gaze there was not only fear, but also shame. Deep, all-consuming shame. A palpable silence fell over the dining room. He could hear only his own breathing and the distant hum of the city outside the window. He saw her lower lip tremble. He saw her trying to swallow the lump in her throat. He slowly pushed the plate of pancakes away. They no longer mattered. Nothing mattered except the answer to one question. The one question that articulated everything he needed to know. He bowed his head, his dark eyes fixed on her face. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his intonation. He uttered only 2 words. 2 words that hung in the air, heavy and pitiless, like a sentence. Who is he? Those 2 words said it all. Not, what happened? Not, who did this? The question, who is he? Suggested Chang-min had already figured it out. He knew it was a man. He knew it wasn't an accident. He knew this man was a threat. And now all he needed was a name, an identity. Ayla froze. It was as if she had turned into a statue. All the air had left her lungs. She looked at him, and a storm of emotions was visible in her eyes. Shock at having her secret revealed. Fear of the consequences of this conversation. Shame for her situation, and perhaps a tiny spark of hope. Because whoever asked this question wasn't just an employer. He was the one who could solve any problem, forever. And she realized there was no point in hiding it anymore. The truth was written all over her face, literally. It's Marcus, she breathed, and the name felt like it burned her lips when she said it out loud. My husband! She fell silent, gathering her thoughts, the strength to put her shame into words. Chang-min didn't interrupt. He sat motionless, his hands resting palms down on the table, and he listened. He listened the way only people in his position can, fully immersed in the story, filtering out emotion and leaving only the dry facts, the details that would later form a plan of action. And she began to tell her story. At first, slowly, haltingly, choosing her words, and then, as if breaking a dam, faster, more desperately, trying to release all the pent-up pain. It all started a few months ago. Her voice was quiet, hoarse from holding back tears. At first, it was just comments. He didn't like that I was home late. He'd say, "What are you doing there? Cooking dinner for one person? That's a whole day?" He didn't understand that every detail had to be perfect, that I couldn't just heat up convenience foods, that I had to check and double-check everything. She fell silent, swallowing hard. Then he found out how much you were paying me. It became a real problem. He works as a car mechanic. His salary barely covers rent and food. And I started earning several times more. At first, he just grumbled, said it wasn't normal for a cook to earn more than a qualified specialist. And then it escalated into something more. She finally looked up at him, her eyes a mixture of shame and despair. He started talking about you, asking what you were like, how old you were, why you, a successful and wealthy man, hired me, a young black woman with no experience. There was such bitterness in his voice, such envy. He thought you were better than him, smarter, richer, more important. And the fact that I was around you, working for you, was like a constant reminder of his own inadequacy. He didn't want anyone superior to him around me. It bruised his male ego. Ayla lowered her head, her fingers nervously fiddling with the hem of her apron. 3 weeks ago, for the first time, he directly demanded that I quit. He said I'd find another job with normal hours and without suspicious bosses. I tried to explain to him, Mr. Lee. I told him that we couldn't live on his salary, that this job was the chance of a lifetime, that you trusted me, that you'd invested so much time and resources in me. Me and ye, she. But he wouldn't listen. He screamed that I didn't respect him, that I preferred some stranger to him. She took a deep breath, her shoulders shaking. I didn't listen. I couldn't quit that job. It wasn't just about the money. It was my life, my dignity. And then he hit me for the first time. The story sped up, as if she were afraid that if she stopped, she wouldn't find the strength to continue. At first it was just a push, then a slap, and then it escalated. Every time I came home from work, he'd be met with the same question. Did you quit? And if the answer was no, it would begin. Verbal humiliation, insults, and everything else. She instinctively touched the bruise on her cheek. He's adopted a new tactic lately. He started hitting me so hard that the marks are visible. On my face, on my arms. He'd say, "Let's see if you'll go to work tomorrow looking like this. Will you make food for your precious boss with bruises on you? You should be ashamed." He wanted me to be ashamed, so I'd quit my job because I wouldn't be able to show up in public. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't even try to wipe them away. The last few days, I haven't been home. After he did it last time, I was scared. I stayed overnight at my mom's, then at a friend's. I told them we'd had a fight. I couldn't admit what was really going on. I was so ashamed. This morning, I went home to get more things, and he was there. He was waiting for me, and this, she gestured to her face again, is the result. He said that if I didn't quit today, he wouldn't leave a single unharmed spot on me. He said that I was his wife and I would obey him, not someone else. She finished her story and sat hunched over, small and vulnerable, in her chef's uniform, which suddenly began to feel like a clown costume, a parody of the professional identity she so cherished. She expected anything: cold indifference, a rational suggestion to call the police, even dismissal for bringing her personal problems into his home. But Lee Chang-min remained silent. He didn't move. His face remained a mask of imperturbability, but something had changed in his dark, deep eyes. The detachment was gone. Concentration had appeared. The same concentration with which he studied reports before an important deal. Only now, the object of his analysis was human pain. He rose from his chair. His movements were smooth and full of hidden strength. He walked around the table and stopped next to her. He made no attempt to hug or comfort her. Physical contact was not his policy, but his presence, his very figure, radiated such unshakable confidence that Ayla involuntarily stopped trembling. He looked down at her, and his voice when he spoke was quiet, but so weighty that every word seemed carved in stone. "Your suffering is over," he said. "From this moment on." He paused, allowing her to absorb the meaning of what he had said. "You will stay here, in this house. I will give you a room. You will be safe." Ayla's eyes widened. She couldn't believe her ears. Stay here, in his fortress? This was beyond her wildest hopes. "And with your husband," he continued, and for the first time a steely note could be heard in his voice, "I'll deal with it. Like a man." He said the phrase with such simplicity, as if he were saying he was going to fix a broken kitchen appliance, but behind those words lay a vast abyss of meaning. "I'll make sure, at the very least, that this tyrant never raises a hand against you again. Not against you, not against any other woman. He'll understand his mistake, deeply and for a very long time." He looked at her, and there was something almost paternal in his gaze. "And at the very most," he bowed his head slightly, "he won't say anything, at all, ever." Ayla froze. She understood what he meant. At the most meant that Marcus could disappear from her life forever, physically. The thought should have terrified her, disgusted her. But instead, she felt only a chilling relief. She caught herself thinking this and was immediately horrified at herself. "The most interesting part," he added, something vaguely resembling a smile twitching at the corners of his lips, "I'll save for last. You'll find out about that a little later." He didn't explain what that meant. He simply let her know he had a plan. A more subtle and sophisticated one. "Go," he said softly but firmly. "Choose any room on the second floor, except for the 3 by the western window. They're occupied. Get yourself ready. Rest. My men will take care of your things. Ayla rose slowly from her chair. Her legs were wobbly, but now it was the weakness of sudden relief. She looked at him, at this withdrawn, powerful man who had just turned her life upside down. Mr. Lee! I'm so embarrassed. I dumped my problems on you. This is wrong. He waved his hand, cutting off her thanks and apologies. You're my employee. You ensure my comfort. I, in turn, ensure your safety. It's a deal, nothing personal. But she knew that wasn't quite true. He could have simply found another chef, a clean slate, spend another 6 months training. That would have been rational, but he chose a different path, more challenging, more personal. She nodded, unable to find the words, and staggered out of the dining room. As she climbed the wide staircase to the second floor, a strange mixture of emotions overwhelmed her. Yes, she felt awkward, uneasy, knowing she now owed him not only her salary, but also her well-being, her security. She felt the lines between employer and employee, between Mr. L and Isla, begin to blur. But beneath this layer of awkwardness, deep within her soul, dwelt another, far more powerful feeling, understanding. She realized she was incredibly lucky that at the very moment her life had turned into hell, she had a man by her side with the power and the will to wield it. Not everyone could boast such a thing. Most women in her situation were left alone with their tyrant, living for years in fear, with no hope of salvation. She caught herself thinking, a thought that at first seemed selfish, but then began to make more and more sense. She had to seize this opportunity. She had to allow herself to be protected by this strength. Otherwise, Marcus, this weak, insecure man, would ultimately destroy her. He had almost succeeded. He was destroying her self-esteem, her joy, her faith in people. A little more, and he would take everything from her, including her life itself. His own insecurities, his inferiority complex, had become a weapon that he aimed at the person closest to him. She entered the first available room she found. It was spacious, bright, and had its own bathroom. Everything was spotlessly clean and expensive. It was heaven compared to the small apartment she shared with Marcus, where every single thing reminded her of arguments and fear. Ayla closed the door and leaned her back against it. She took a deep breath, then exhaled. For the first time in months, her shoulders relaxed. For the first time, she felt like the walls around her weren't bars, but protection. She knew the problems weren't solved yet. Marcus was out there somewhere. But now, Elle and Chengmin stood behind her, and that knowledge was stronger than any wall. The night in the mansion was unnaturally quiet. Isla, having tucked herself into her new room, allowed her body to relax for the first time in months. She lay there, listening to the silence, and realized she'd forgotten the feeling of falling asleep without fear. There was no need to feign sleep, holding her breath when Marcus returned to the apartment. Here, the walls were a reliable shield. While she slept, a different atmosphere reigned in Elle and Chengmin's office, tense and businesslike. He sat behind his massive desk, and in front of him stood 3 of his most trusted assistants. No unnecessary words, no emotion, just work. The cook, her husband. He beats her! Changmin cut to the chase. His voice was even and cold as steel. She gave us an address and agreed to our intervention. The task is to find him and devise a punishment that will permanently remove his desire to hurt the weak, physically and mentally. Marcus's face appeared on the monitor behind him. An unfortunate photo from a social media site. An ordinary man with an angry, disgruntled look. Jin Ho, the most senior of the assistants, was the first to break the silence. A simple beating won't solve the problem. The bitterness will remain. We need to break his very pattern of behavior. He feels powerful when he bullies someone who can't fight back. We need to show him what true powerlessness feels like. Tex, a young specialist in silent solutions, nodded. We could arrange a meeting where he finds himself in the role of the victim, one against several, so he feels absolutely defenseless. It's a psychological blow that hits harder than fists. Changmin's right-hand man, Li, added, he needs to understand the reason. He needs to know that this isn't a random attack, but a direct consequence of his actions. Retribution for every bruise on Ayla's face. Changmin listened to everyone, his face unreadable. He had already formulated a plan in his head. Now he needed to voice it. There will be physical force, he said, but measured, to demonstrate power, not to cripple. His main vulnerability is his bruised ego. He's jealous of Ayla's success, her salary, Her work for me. We'll target that. He turned to Jin-ho. He has outstanding interest rates. We'll buy them all out. We'll be his sole creditor. There was a short pause in the room as those present realized the simplicity and effectiveness of this move. After our conversation, Changmin continued, he will sign new terms. He will have no right to approach Ayla or contact her. He will write a letter of apology, dictated by us. If he breaks the rule, even years from now, his debt, with enormous interest, will go to people who will not talk. He will live with this sword over his head for the rest of his days. It was elegant and brutal. Physical pain will pass, but financial slavery and constant fear will not. But that's not all. Changmin looked up. The highlight for last will get him a job. This time his people did not hide their surprise. To one of my garages on the other side of town for the same position, but his boss will be a woman. Young, competent, strict. He'll go to work every day, assigned to him by the man whose employee he attacked, and he'll obey her orders. No resignation for 5 years. If he quits, the sentence will be revoked. The room fell silent. This wasn't just a punishment plan. It was a reforging. They were locking him in a world he hated, forcing him to accept what he had fought so fiercely against in his own wife. He'll be the most disciplined worker, Tex quietly stated. Exactly, Changmin concluded. We don't cripple an animal. We train it. We change its nature. Strength should generate responsibility, and weakness means learning to ask for help, not looking for someone to humiliate. The plan was ready. The details were worked out. Tomorrow they would visit Marcus Jackson. This wasn't about revenge. This was about restoring order and ensuring the quality of the tom yum for lunch. Morning had arrived. Sunlight flooded the dining room, but today it seemed brighter and kinder. Ayla stood in the kitchen, preparing pancake batter. Her movements were smooth, confident. There was none of the nervous trembling in her hands that appeared when she thought about returning home. Instead, there was a strange, almost unfamiliar sense of peace. She heard voices ringing out in the house, firm, masculine, businesslike. It was Elle and Changmin's men gathering. She knew where they were going and why. But instead of curiosity or a thirst for revenge, she felt only a slight detachment. She wasn't even interested in what exactly they had planned. Her entire being, her entire soul, craved one thing, to savor this fragile, yet oh so strong feeling of safety. The feeling that no danger lurked behind these walls, that she could breathe freely. When she brought out a plate of perfectly golden pancakes and placed it in front of Changmin, their eyes met. He looked at her questioningly, as if giving her one last chance to change her mind, to revoke his unspoken order. Ayla held his gaze. Her eyes were calm. He deserves everything you've prepared for him, she said quietly but clearly. Every bit of it. I don't feel sorry for him. She had nothing more to say. There was no hatred, no anger, just a cold statement of fact. Marcus had crossed all boundaries, and now he was reaping the consequences. She mentally let him go. He was no longer her problem. These words were enough for Elle and Changmin. The nod he gave her was barely noticeable, but satisfaction flashed in his eyes. Her determination gave his plan ultimate legitimacy. He was acting not only as a protector, but also as an executor of the victim's will. With even greater, cold enthusiasm, he rose from the table. The deed was done in his mind. All that remained was to put it into practice. Unmarked cars pulled up silently to a nondescript apartment building in the Lower Heights neighborhood. Lee Changmin, Jinho, Tex, and Lee climbed the stairs. The air in the entryway smelled of old linoleum and cheap lunch. Jin H knocked on the door. The knock was firm, but not aggressive. Something thudded inside, and muffled curses echoed. The door swung open slightly on its chain. Marcus's haggard, unshaven face appeared in the crack. His eyes were cloudy, revealing fatigue and hidden malice. Marcus Jackson? Jin-ho's voice was polite, neutral, like a courier or a government employee. We're here about your wife, Ayla. It's work-related. We need to discuss some formalities. Marcus's expression betrayed a war between suspicion and curiosity. He was one of those men whose self-doubt was evident in every feature. In his hunched shoulders, his nervous gaze, his aggressive stance. A man who had achieved nothing in life and could only assert himself at the expense of those weaker than him. The thought that they had come to punish him apparently didn't even cross his mind. He clicked the chain with relief and opened the door. "What else has she done?" he muttered, ushering the four men into the cramped, cluttered hallway. The moment the door closed, the atmosphere in the apartment changed instantly and irrevocably. The air became heavy and cold. The polite masks on the guests' faces fell. Lee Changmin, who had been standing behind him, stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, but every word took on a steely weight, crashing against the walls of the squalid apartment. "Marcus," he said, and the name sounded like a death sentence. "You will answer for your actions, for every bruise, for every tear, for every moment of fear you gave your wife." Marcus recoiled, his eyes wide with horror and incomprehension. He tried to say something, to utter something aggressive, but he was quickly and professionally restrained and forced into a chair. Resistance was futile. "First, you'll feel what she felt," Changmin continued, his voice as even as a surgeon describing an operation. "Helplessness, fear, the realization that you're not in control and can't protect yourself." It all happened very quickly, without unnecessary noise, without shouting. A few precise, crushing blows, not to maim but to break his spirit, to wipe the arrogance and malice from his face and replace them with the same animal fear he saw in Ayla's eyes. Marcus wheezed, trying to catch his breath, his body shaking with pain and humiliation. When they let him go, he sat hunched over, sobbing, not at all like the tyrant who had terrorized the woman. "Now," Changmin said, and Tex placed a piece of paper and a pen on the table in front of Marcus. "You will write her a letter. You will apologize, sincerely, for every single pain you've caused." Jin-ho began dictating, phrase after phrase. Marcus, with a bloody lip and shaking hands, obediently wrote out the letters. "Forgive me, Ayla, for all those nights when you were afraid to come home. T, forgive me for the bruises and the fear. I realized I was a weak and insignificant person." It wasn't just an apology, it was public self-abasement, an admission of one's own worthlessness. For someone with such an ego, it was more terrifying than any beating. When the letter was finished, Marcus looked broken and devastated. All his false masculinity had been trampled into dust. Lee Changming picked up the scribbled sheet of paper from the table, folded it, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Remember today, Marcus," he said, looking down at him for the last time. "You'll never see her again, and if you ever again think of raising a hand against someone weaker than you, remember our visit today. It will seem like a piece of cake." They turned and walked out of the apartment as silently as they had entered, leaving behind a broken man who had just learned the most important lesson of his life. They didn't tell him about the debts or the new job. That was a surprise awaiting him in the very near future. The letter of apology was only the first act of retribution. The most interesting things for Marcus Jackson were yet to come. The sun was at its zenith when the cars silently returned to the mansion. The air was thick with the sense of work completed, hard but necessary. Lee Changmin and his men entered the house, and the atmosphere was strikingly different from what they had left behind in Marcus's apartment. It smelled of cleanliness, expensive wood, and subtle, complex aromas emanating from the kitchen. Changmin, from the doorway, caught the eye of Lee, his assistant, who was waiting for him in the hall. "She's in the kitchen. Everything is ready, as you requested," he quietly reported. Changmin nodded. He took off his jacket, and Tex, without a word, accepted it. The fabric was dusty from the stranger's entrance, but not a drop of blood. Everything had gone smoothly. Before entering the dining room, Changmin paused for a moment in front of the mirror in the hallway. He straightened his tie and ran a hand through his hair. This wasn't just a gesture of self-admiration, it was a rite of passage. He was leaving behind that man, the cold, ruthless judge who had just returned from work. Now he was returning to his home, to his cook, to dinner. The dining room was in perfect harmony. The table, usually reserved for him alone, was set for several. The silverware glittered in the sunlight, and the crystal glasses cast iridescent reflections on the tablecloth. Low vases filled with fresh white orchids stood in the center of the table. Ayla finished the final preparations. She adjusted the napkin and checked the position of the plate. As Changmin entered, she turned around, and he saw something he hadn't seen in weeks. Her face was calm. The muscles around her eyes and mouth were relaxed. Her gaze, usually tense and shifty, was now clear and direct. A slight, almost elusive smile played on her lips. Not the forced smile she'd tried to fake before, but a genuine, natural expression of profound relief. She looked as if a heavy backpack she'd been lugging for miles had been lifted from her. "Dinner is served, Mr. Lee," she said, and her voice rang with a long-forgotten confidence. He nodded, his gaze sweeping around the table. "Excellent. Sit." Ayla hesitated for a moment. The old reflex, knowing one's place, staying in the kitchen, kicked in automatically. "Me?" she repeated. "Yes, you. We're having lunch together today. That's all." Ho, Tex, and Lee entered the dining room. They had also changed, removing the traces of their morning visit. Their faces were calm, but their eyes showed weariness from the task they had accomplished. Everyone took their seats. Chang Min at the head of the table, Ayla to his right, his assistants to his left. There was a brief but not awkward pause. Ayla ladled the tom yum soup into bowls, her signature dish, with its perfect balance of spiciness, sourness, and coconut creaminess. Chang Min raised his spoon. It was the signal to begin. For the first few minutes, everyone ate in silence, savoring the flavors. Ayla watched them sample her food, and an old, familiar expression appeared on her face, the expectation of approval. It returned, along with a feeling of security. Chang Min sipped from his glass of water and set it down on the table. The clink of crystal sounded almost solemn. "So, Ayla," he began, his voice even and calm, the way she always knew it to be at this table. "We've come to visit your husband." All eyes turned to her. She put down her spoon, folded her hands in her lap, and prepared to listen. There was no fear or impatience on her face, only quiet curiosity and the same unfailing smile of relief. Ho did most of the talking. His narrative was dry, devoid of emotion, like a report on a job well done. He spoke clearly and to the point, omitting the most brutal details, but not embellishing either. "We entered. We explained a reason for our visit." He tried to resist, but was quickly neutralized. He was shown the very same fear and helplessness he made you feel. He understood everything, very quickly. Tex, when the topic of demonstration came up, merely nodded silently, confirming Jinho's words. His role was clear, even without words. "After that," Jinho continued, "he wrote a letter, under our dictation. He apologized for every time he raised his hand against you, for every bruise, for every fear you had." Lee Changmin pulled a neatly folded piece of paper from his inside jacket pocket and placed it next to Ayla's plate. "It's yours. You can read it whenever you want, or throw it away. It's your decision." Ayla glanced at the envelope, but didn't take it. The letter didn't matter to her. The fact was more important than words. The fact was that these people had gone and done what needed to be done. "He'll never touch you again," Changmin concluded. "And most likely, no one else. We provided him with a powerful incentive to improve." He didn't go into the details of the motivation, the cleared debts, and the prospect of working under a woman. These were technicalities that didn't concern her. The result was guaranteed. Ayla listened to the entire story from beginning to end, without interrupting. Her smile never left her face. It wasn't a smile of cruel triumph or revenge. It was the smile of a person who had finally heard the long-awaited news of the end of a long and debilitating illness. She nodded as Jin H described how Marcus understood everything. This was exactly what she wanted to hear. Not the details of his suffering, but a statement of fact. He had realized his guilt and was stopped, forever. When the story ended, she looked from Jin Ho to Lee Changmin. "Thank you," she said simply. And in that single word, she expressed the depth of her gratitude, not only for her own safety, but for the restoration of her sense of self-worth. Lunch continued. Hot dishes replaced soup. The atmosphere at the table became even more relaxed. Changmin's assistants, usually silent, began discussing neutral work-related topics. Ayla felt part of something larger, part of this strange but reliable system. And so, as dinner was drawing to a close and Ayla was about to get up to bring dessert, Lee Changmin stopped her with a gesture. "Be patient. There's still something we need to discuss, something you haven't figured out yet." He pushed his plate away and folded his hands on the table. His posture changed, becoming more formal. His assistants also fell silent, their gazes becoming attentive, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Ayla froze, her light expression giving way to mild bewilderment. What else could it be? Her problem was solved. She had been given safety and shelter. What could be more important than that? Changmin looked at her directly, and in his usually unreadable eyes, she saw something new. Not cold calculation, not detachment, but a certain firm, unwavering determination. "You've come a long way in these 6 months," he began. "You've transformed from an insecure girl into a professional I can count on blindly. You've become more than just a cook. You've become an indispensable part of my day, my routine, my comfort." He paused, letting her realize what he'd said. "You've shown your strength, and not just in cooking. You've endured pressure, kept quiet, trying to save your marriage, and finally found the courage to ask for help when you realized you couldn't cope alone anymore. I respect that." Ayla listened, unable to move. His words were so unexpected and personal that they took her breath away. "You'll stay here, in this house," he continued. "Permanently. This is your home now. But I don't want you to stay here for long, just as a cook or just a single woman." He fell silent again, and in the silence of the dining room, his next words came out with absolute crystal clarity. "Ayla, I want to make you my wife. If you don't mind, of course." The air froze. Ayla felt the floor shift beneath her. She stared at him, disbelieving her ears. She expected to hear anything: a raise, new responsibilities, maybe even a rebuke for the problems she'd brought into the house. But not this. Nothing in his behavior, not a single look, not a single word in all these months had hinted at anything like that. Her gaze darted to his assistants. Their faces remained calm, as if they had just heard not a marriage proposal, but a new business plan. They knew. They had known everything in advance. This is what they had discussed, planned. This was Changmin's final highlight. The shock was so intense that she couldn't make a sound. She sat there, staring at him with wide eyes, fragments of thoughts racing through her head. This day had brought so much good: liberation, security, peace. And now, to top it all off, the most incredible and stunning proposal of her life. The day had gone from simply good to fateful. She saw his gaze, firm, confident, devoid of a shadow of doubt. He wasn't asking. He was stating his desire and waiting for her response. And there was no pressure in it. There was only boundless respect for her choice. And then, after a moment of heavy, deafening silence, she found strength. She came to her senses, and her face, initially pale from shock, suddenly lit up with a bright, radiant smile, the likes of which had never been seen even in relief. It was a smile of happiness, true, deep, unexpected happiness. "Of course," she breathed, her voice trembling with the emotion that overwhelmed her. "Of course I agree." Nothing more was needed, no unnecessary words. Her answer was as simple and clear as his proposal. Li Changming nodded, and something she'd never seen before in their entire acquaintance flickered in his eyes. A deep, silent satisfaction. He rose from the table. She, still trembling, did the same. He didn't hug her or kiss her in front of everyone. Instead, he simply walked up to her, took her hand, and placed it on his elbow. "Let's walk," he said quietly. "We need to discuss the details, in private." And they left the dining room, leaving his assistants at the table. Lee, Jinho, and Tex exchanged glances. Subtle smiles appeared on their usually imperturbable faces. The plan was accomplished, all problems solved, and there was still some tom yum in the kitchen, which, as the boss had predicted, hadn't had time to cool. They left the dining room and walked down the long corridor. Ayla's hand rested on his crooked arm, and she felt the fine wool of his jacket and the hard muscles beneath her fingers. She was still trembling, and her mind refused to fully comprehend what had just happened. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing on the polished parquet floor. He led her not into his office, but into a small living room she rarely saw. The room was cozier, with a large fireplace, ceiling-high bookshelves, and soft sofas. It smelled of leather and old books. He released her hand and gestured for her to sit. Ayla sank onto the edge of the sofa, still feeling as if she'd fallen into someone else's dream. Li Changmin sat across from her, his posture as perfect as ever, but his eyes lacked the usual detachment. "You're surprised," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she breathed out. I didn't expect it. Nothing like this. I thought I was just an employee for you, a convenient tool." "You were," he answered bluntly. "The first few months. But people aren't tools. They change. And I changed my mind. I watched you, not just in the kitchen, I saw how you learned, how you absorbed knowledge, how you treated your work not as a duty, but as an art. I saw your resilience. And today, I saw your wisdom. You don't seek revenge, you seek peace. That's a rare quality. He spoke calmly, analytically, but in his words, through the cracks of icy logic, something vaguely resembling warmth broke through. But why? She ventured. Why me? You could have chosen anyone, any woman from your circle. The women in my circle, his lips curled momentarily, are interested in my score, not my Tom Yum. They wear masks. You, however, were always the real deal. Even when you were scared, you didn't pretend to be brave. You simply did your job. In my world, that's worth a lot. You brought more than just delicious food to this house. You brought order, predictability. You became part of my routine, and I don't want to change that part. I want to cement it, forever. Ayla listened, and his words, so rational, so devoid of romanticism, seemed more honest and weighty to her than any vows of love. He wasn't saying he loved her. He was saying he valued her, respected her, and needed her presence. For her, raised in a world where words often diverged from actions, this was more than love. It was trust. I don't know what kind of wife I'd be, she admitted quietly. I was a bad wife to Marcus. I couldn't make him happy. You were a victim, not a wife, he corrected sharply. And you weren't supposed to make him happy. He was supposed to ensure your happiness and safety. He failed. I'm not asking you to make me happy. I'm asking you to be yourself. Make your own pancakes. Maintain the peace you brought to this house. Everything else is details we'll figure out together. He stood and walked to the window, looking out onto the garden. I'm not offering you a conventional marriage. I'm offering you a partnership. You will be my wife, the mistress of this house. Your life will be protected. Your interests will be my interests. Your past ended this morning. With this letter, he nodded toward the dining room. Ayla looked at his back, at his confident, unwavering stance. Fear and uncertainty gradually receded, giving way to a new, strange certainty. He was right. Her old life was over. Marcus, the humiliation, the fear, all of it was in the past. And he wasn't just offering her marriage. He was offering her a new identity, a new destiny. I won't let you down, Mr. Lee, she said, her voice firm for the first time that evening. He turned around. Chongmin, when we're alone, you can call me Changmin. She nodded, feeling the full significance of this permission. What now? She asked. Now? The official procedures, the paperwork, everything will be arranged quickly and quietly. You'll be moving into the other apartments, in the East Wing. They're more spacious. You'll be able to furnish them to your liking. He paused and looked at her with a slight smile that softened his stern expression. And now, I think we should get back to our Tom Yum. It's really very good today, and perhaps we should discuss the menu for our wedding. I heard the groom gets cake. He approached her and offered his arm again. This time, her hand settled confidently on his elbow. The trembling subsided. They left the living room and headed back to the dining room, where a new life awaited them, beginning with a bowl of hot soup and a single question that would change everything forever. They left the living room, and Ayla realized with surprise that the house, which had been her workplace for 6 months, suddenly spoke to her in a different language. The familiar hallways, the paintings on the walls, even the reflection of light on the polished banisters. Everything took on a new, profound meaning. She walked, still feeling the fabric of his jacket under her fingers, and this light contact was like a wire connecting her old life to her new. Silence reigned in the dining room. As if on cue, Changmin's assistants withdrew, leaving the table set but empty. The remains of the tom yum had been cleared away, replaced by a porcelain tea set and a small plate of elegant pastries. They seemed to understand that the master of the house and his future wife needed some privacy now, but in a new capacity. Changmin led her to the table and poured tea into 2 thin porcelain cups. His movements were measured, ritualistic. He placed the cup in front of her, and Ayla noticed how delicate her dark hand looked against the snow-white porcelain. This simple visual contrast suddenly seemed to her a symbol of their entire future. A union of 2 different worlds that, nevertheless, looked surprisingly harmonious. To your peace, he said quietly, raising his cup. There was no pathos in his tone, only a statement. For hours, she corrected, her own boldness surprising her. He nodded approvingly. They drank. The tea was green, tart, with a slight floral aftertaste. It burned their lips, but pleasantly warmed them from the inside. I won't bear your name, Ayla said suddenly, looking at him. She didn't know where the thought came from, but it was important. She needed to preserve a part of herself, the one he valued in her. I didn't suggest it, he replied without batting an eye. You're Ayla. That's your name. Your professional name. It carries weight. Changing it wouldn't be rational. His answer was again logical and practical, and that reassured her. He wasn't trying to swallow her whole, to erase her identity. He accepted her as she was. How will everything be arranged? She asked, finally asking the practical question that had been hanging in the air. Official, quickly and quietly, in 3 days. Here, in this house. Only the essential people and my closest aides. No pomp. This is not a showy event, but a business agreement, sealed with a seal. He spoke calmly, as if he were planning a supply chain. After the ceremony, you will have access to all my resources. Your personal accounts, your security, your responsibilities. Everything will be documented. You must not depend solely on my favor. You will be protected by law and agreements. Ayla listened, amazed by the depth of his preparation. He'd thought through everything, down to the smallest detail, ensuring her not just status, but real, tangible security and independence within their union. What about my duties? In the kitchen? Was the question that troubled her most. The kitchen was her territory, her sanctuary. He detected a note of anxiety in her voice. Nothing will change unless you want it to. You are the head chef of this house. That's your position, and it will remain so. If over time, you want to delegate some of your responsibilities to focus on something else, managing the house, charity work, your own projects, that will be your decision. I hired you as a chef, but I offer you a partnership as an equal. Equal? She couldn't help but smile slightly. We are very different, Changmin. Equal in rights and respect, he corrected. Our roles are different. Our contributions are different, but your word in matters that concern you and this house will carry the same weight as mine. He took another sip of tea and looked at her over the rim of his cup. There is one condition. Ayla became wary. What? You will never cook in containers for my business trips again. She laughed. It was a genuine, light laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in months. It sounded strange in the austere dining room, but it seemed to fill the room with light. I promise, she smiled, but only if you take me with you on your next trip, so I can personally check the quality of the products on site. For the first time all evening, an expression that could be described as genuine, undisguised surprise appeared on his face, followed by approval. He nodded. Agreed. They finished their tea in comfortable silence. Ayla looked out the window, where evening was beginning to fall. Just a few hours ago, her life had been divided into before and after getting rid of Marcus. Now she stood on the threshold of another, far more grandiose after. But this time, she wasn't overcome with fear. She was filled with a strange, calm sense of anticipation. It wasn't a dizzying romance. It was a sense of having made the right choice. A choice based not on fleeting passion, but on deep mutual respect and a shared goal. To preserve the fragile peace and order they both cherished so much. Changmin stood up. You should rest. There's a lot to do tomorrow. Lee will help you move into your new apartment and select staff who will report directly to you. She nodded and stood up as well. He walked with her to the stairs leading to the second floor. She climbed a few steps, then turned around. He was still standing below, watching her, his formal suited figure seeming an integral part of the house, its stone core. Changmin? She called. Yes? Thank you for everything, but especially for asking, for giving me a choice. He bowed his head silently. It was his way of accepting gratitude. Ayla turned and walked down the hallway toward her, still old room. Tomorrow was moving day. The day after that, preparations for the ceremony, and in 3 days, her life would change forever. But now, in the quiet of the evening, she thought of only one thing. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't frighten her. It looked delicious. And she knew for sure that they would have her perfect pancakes for breakfast. 3 days flew by. The morning of the ceremony began for Ayla with a familiar ritual. She stood in her new, even more spacious kitchen in the East Wing, preparing pancake batter. But today was different. There was no rush, no anxiety, only a calm, bright sense of anticipation. She moved more slowly, deliberately, as if feeling the weight of every movement, every breath. When she carried the plate into the dining room, Chang-min was already waiting for her. He was wearing his usual formal suit, but today a small silver pin was pinned to his lapel, the only hint of the significance of the moment. They ate breakfast almost in silence, but this silence was different, not awkward, but full. He put down his fork and nodded. Perfect. That was enough. The ceremony took place precisely at noon in the same office where they had once planned the visit to Marcus. Only Lee, Jin-ho, and Tex were present as witnesses, and an elderly official who quickly and calmly completed the formalities. No rings, no kisses, no vows, just a few signatures under a thick folder of documents. When Ayla signed, she felt not romantic excitement, but a deep, calm sense of rightness. She was not getting married. She was forming a union. She was finding her foundation. Chang-min took a thin case from the shelf and opened it. Inside lay not a diamond, but an elegant white gold bracelet with a single stone, a dark sapphire, almost as black as his eyes. "This isn't a wedding ring," he said, clasping the bracelet on her wrist. "It's a sign that you're under my protection, and that your word carries weight in this house." Ayla looked at the dark stone shimmering against her skin. It was beautiful, understated, and perfectly his style. It wasn't a symbol of passion, but a symbol of status and trust. "Thank you," she said. "It's beautiful." The dinner was modest but elegant. Ayla had prepared all the dishes herself, but now she was assisted by a new assistant, a young chef whom Chang-min had hired to free up her time for her new responsibilities. She sat next to Chang-min, and their conversation at the table was businesslike and calm. They discussed reorganizing the pantry, her schedule with the nutritionist, and her planned trip to Seoul in a month. When lunch was over, and the assistants had left, Chang-min turned to her. "Now it's your turn," he said. "Show me how you see your new home. Where do you want to start?" Ayla smiled. She led him into her new living room and laid out on the table the fabric catalogs and paint samples she had been collecting for the past 2 days. "I think it needs more light here," she said, gesturing toward the heavy curtains. "And color. Not bright, but warm, like the color of ripe wheat." He listened attentively, nodding, asking clarifying questions about suppliers. "And the budget?" He didn't argue or impose his opinion. He let her build. Late in the evening, when the first decisions had been made and the house had become quiet again, Ayla stepped out into her new, small garden adjacent to the apartment. The air was cool and fresh. She stood, looking at the house's illuminated windows, and reflected on the dizzying pace of change. Just a week ago, she'd been a terrified victim, making pancakes in exchange for a paycheck and a false sense of security. Now she stood here as a hostess, a partner, a wife. Her value was measured not only in money, but in trust, in respect, in the silent power she gave this house simply by her presence and her skill. She didn't feel dizzying love, but she felt something more solid and precious, absolute security, deep respect, and the right to be herself. She was his chef, his apprentice, and now his wife. And this wasn't a fairy tale, but a reality they had built together. Her story wasn't ending happily. It was simply moving on to a new, far more interesting chapter. And Ayla knew, in this chapter, her perfect pancakes would be for breakfast again. And this was only the beginning.